Amanda. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. And for those of you just joining, please get that chat box open. Would love to know where you are joining us from here this morning, this afternoon, or this evening, depending on where you are. I'm Doug Hutton here at Corporate Visions, joined today by Paul Ironside, CEO at Commercial Tribe. Paul, thanks for joining us this morning.
My pleasure, Doug. Good to be with you.
Absolutely. Paul and I will share why you shouldn't trust your gut in the world of sales management here today. But I want to get us started with asking the group what the following 3 words, things, people might have in common. Drop your answer in the chat. And those 3 things are Marie Kondo, Charlemagne, and marching band drum majors. If anyone can draw the connection between Marie Kondo, Charlemagne, and drum majors, I will personally send you a $50 Amazon gift card. What do Marie Kondo, Charlemagne, and marching band drum majors have in common? I've got joy from Daniel, minimalism from Mary, discipline, Daniel. They're all on this slide. Lauren, that wins the best response of the chat. Thank you. Order, Josh. Josh is actually the winner right there on order. So Josh Fogel, I may need to get the address. But thinking about Josh's response there of order, and I'd go one step further, making order out of chaos. So for those of you who have watched perhaps some of Marie Kondo's great work on Netflix, all about bringing order to that cluttered, chaotic household. Not just minimalism, but how do you bring order out of chaos in your own home? For the history buffs on the call, Charlemagne was the first king to really unify Western Europe after the fall of the ancient Roman Empire, really kicking off the new Holy Roman Empire in the dawn of the Middle Ages of sorts. And marching band drum majors, I admit, that was me, bringing order out of the chaos of hundreds of people marching around and making it look good and doing it at the same time. Now, that same concept, bringing order out of chaos, I think you'd agree is often what a sales manager is trying to do on a day-to-day basis in their world. Because if you think about the chaos that a manager faces day in and day out, and the multiplicity of things that they are being asked to do, and you see just a small sampling of them on the page. I'm sure in chat you could list off 5, 10 more things that a manager has to be doing on a day-to-day basis, whether that's team meetings, one-on-ones with individual team members, whether that's reporting on the forecast up to their sales leader and out into the organization. With the growth of revenue intelligence, the call recordings that just exist and pop up every day. If you manage a team of 7 sellers and they're each making 5 sales calls a day, that's 35 new call recordings that you may have the opportunity to listen to. How about those territory reviews? How often are you doing a QBR with each of your sellers about their territory? So let's be honest, that manager's world is often just as chaotic as what Marie Kondo may walk into when she enters a new home. But where I'm excited to bring Paul into the conversation, the work the Commercial Tribe is doing, and really this thinking of how should a manager bring order to this chaos? How should they establish a operating cadence, a sales management process to bring order to this chaos? Because if the chaos remains, sales managers are not being good stewards of their time, and they're not being good stewards of the organization's time and effort. So with that as set up, let me bring Paul into the conversation here and how the work that the Commercial Tribe is doing can actually help solve this chaotic problem for sales managers and sales leaders. So again, Paul, thank you for joining us. Welcome. And I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Let me go ahead and get my screen shared here this morning, and thanks for the kickoff. And Doug, I'm assuming you're looking at my, all right, terrific. Hey, maybe just by way of background and introduction, you are what I'd like to characterize talking to a sales executive at the end of the day. Born and raised in the function, born and raised at Gartner many years ago, started out as an individual contributor, and like many sales managers kind of forged and promoted into the role as an individual contributor to a sales manager. I left and went to an organization based in Washington, D.C., the Corporate Executive Board, or CEB. That's where I met Doug. Was there for about 10 years. Last 3 years, ran the sales organization, direct report to the chairman and CEO. Kind of long-winded way of saying we're talking to somebody that has built and scaled sales organizations. And I submit that respectfully and humbly, just given some of the participants. I think the $600 some odd million in ARR that I was managing might be a rounding error to some of the companies that we're talking to here on the call. But nonetheless, I think it's a good place to pick up the conversation, Doug, in terms of Charlemagne. Maybe this picture is emblematic of the end of the Holy Roman Empire and the reign, and just these economic headwinds that I think we're all facing today. And I think what happens in these economic headwinds is it exposes the vulnerabilities. And I don't know if you want to pick your financial metric, layoffs, earnings, the Dow. I'm sure for many of the participants today, if we look at the sales metrics that you're focused in on, they're depressed. Extended sales cycles, lower ASPs, missed forecast, fewer reps at plan, and overall lower achievement levels. I think, whoopsie, I'll just skip that. What we see in these economic down cycles is we start to see that the pressure begins to shift towards different parts of the sales organization. No doubt about it, we continue to put pressure on the sales organization and the selling individuals, those individual contributors, but we start to see it shift towards our management process. And I think this quote is kind of emblematic of what we see. This is actually from a recent customer that we were onboarding, and they had just come out of a deal review where they were kind of dipsticking in and observing one of their managers conduct a deal review. And they came back and said, there's just no inspection of key issues, getting to decision makers, budget, timing. Kind of came to the realization that they don't have a sales process problem, but rather a sales management process problem. And I think this quote from our friend Warren Buffett, the Oracle of Omaha, it's only when the tide goes out do you discover who's been swimming naked. And I think right now, just given the economic environment that we found ourselves in, the tide has gone out. All right, let's begin to kind of climb into this a bit, and let me start to frame a couple of questions I'm going to ask you to think about as we get underway here this morning. Number one, which management activities create the most value for your team? How much time should managers spend with new reps versus tenured reps? Have you given your underperforming reps a fair shot before putting them on a PIP or moving them out? And finally, do you know how to replicate your high-performing managers? I think when asked the question, how do you replicate a high-performing seller? You contrast that with a high-performing manager. The answers become a little bit more difficult. Doug, I think we got our first poll question that's coming out. Let me pause here for a minute as this thing starts to surface, and would love to hear from the group, their impressions here on poll question number one.
All right, while folks are pulling up that question there, Paul, I think just reflecting on the questions you put up on the screen a moment ago, I think that last point that you made of there is always so much focus on how do I get more out of the seller? How do I replicate that high performing seller? Because hey, if I had 5 more A players, that'd be fantastic. But I think the role of the sales manager in getting them there is often takes a back seat for the wrong reasons, perhaps. I know you'll explore that, but I think that last point you made is spot on. How much impact does the sales manager have, both him or herself, but then also in lifting the performance of the team as a whole. And as I see the results of the poll coming in, I think today's audience buys into that premise. So maybe, Amanda, we can close that poll and share the results back with the group. Yeah, exactly. Right, they're the linchpin, right? The force multiplier in the equation. And when we ask the question, this is typically what we get back. So I think this role inside the organization, no doubt about it, a critical role, to engineer to the number itself. Am I closing this poll right here?
I'll go ahead and close it.
Terrific. Oh, all right, terrific. Well, let's keep pressing in. Today we're here to learn about the sales management process, or AKA the operating cadence. And when we study the sales management process, we refer to it as sales management intelligence. And perhaps the easiest way of explaining sales management intelligence is by contrasting it with revenue intelligence. And I know that many of today's participants are revenue intelligence customers, and no question, it's a big and growing space, testament to the quotes from both Forrester and Gartner. And no doubt, the revenue intelligence category has emerged as a new category within the tech stack itself. And if we take a look at some of the key players, the Gongs and the Clarys of the world, they have absolutely further quantified the way that we look at the sales function. And among a myriad of insights that they now bring to sales, they at very least have confirmed some of our long-held beliefs. In other words, I think we've always known that being multi-threaded in a deal is a net positive thing in our pipelines. Well, now Gong brings a data-driven insight that says, yes, being multi-threaded increases both the probability of the deal to close, as well as increases the overall ASP. We now have a data-driven insight that now validates that particular impression. Here's how Gartner defines the revenue intelligence space. Capture seller activity, measure deal health, guide sellers to next action. Revenue intelligence is looking at the sales process. Sales management intelligence, by contrast, is looking at the management process. How do we capture manager activities, measure team health, and guide managers to next action? Again, if we go back to the poll and we think about the criticality of that role, how do we begin to understand what managers are doing? How do we begin to optimize, in fact, where they're spending their time to engineer to the greatest outcomes that we can? Okay, when we talk about the management process and the sales management framework, this slide sometimes is helpful to kind of all get on the same page. In this framework, what we're looking at is the role of the manager and the responsibilities that extend across activities with and without the team. So team events consist of one-on-ones, team meetings, pipeline forecast reviews, QBRs, kind of et cetera, et cetera. While the without team events are the internal meetings, interview, call coaching, time blocks, right? The management framework. And when we put a frequency to this, we refer to it as the management cadence. And Doug, I think I've got a cue here. There's another poll for the group that we want to surface. So. Is that right?
Yeah, indeed. And while Amanda puts that poll up on the screen, I want the group to be thinking here about average managers versus high performing managers. Take a read of that question. Which of those activities that you really see on the bottom of this slide here, which of those activities do you believe average managers actually need to be spending a lot more time on relative to high performers? So we will share the answer at some point, I promise. Not yet. But I'd love the group's insight on where they think average performing managers should be spending a lot more time. Because ultimately, again, back to that sort of that world of chaos, this is actually a much more nicely structured view of that chaos, Paul. In a manager's world, there's a lot that they could be doing. There's a lot that they could be improving on with their teams. But I think the interesting question is, which of those improvements will actually lead to better sales results? Because if you think about that revenue intelligence versus sales management intelligence contrast, no one has really yet defined how the manager drives those actions. And so I'm interested here in the results, and it looks like we're slowing down on the responses. Amanda, let's end that poll and share that back. Ooh, we will share the answer to this. I will say that the top scoring, not necessarily what you might think, but Paul, I'm interested in your perspective as you just see an off the cuff from the group with no data, which you'll share some here in a moment.
Yeah. Does
this align with how you see sales managers, sales leaders thinking about things before you jump in to an engagement?
I would say the short answer is yes. I think the world, we just introduced the Gongs and the Clarys of the world and so forth. I just think you see a consolidation in the tech stack, forecasting moving into call intelligence, revenue intelligence. And that, given this distributed remote environment that we find ourselves in, this concept of call coaching becomes more and more interesting. But looking forward to sharing some of the insights and the data that we've got to suggest that maybe that's not the most optimized place that managers spend their time.
We'll come back to that here in a few slides. So remember, everybody, remember your answer to that poll and see if you got it right here in a couple slides.
Okay, so Doug, I'm going to share with the group just a handful of data-driven insights. So who are we and where do we get the data? Commercial Tribe focuses in on the frontline sales manager. Our solution assists the senior-most sales leader and his or her leadership team optimize a frontline sales manager's time spent across key management activities that result in more efficient process, improved productivity, and additional revenue. How we do this is by indexing all of the events on a manager's calendar via Google or Microsoft integration, and we enrich the data with the tenure and performance of their teams so we can get to some data-driven insights by tenure and performance cohorts. And let me just be perfectly clear. We absolutely believe that the frontline sales manager is the heart of a revenue organization, and it is also one of the hardest jobs in the company itself. Okay, so let's get after some of these insights. I'm unfortunately here to report that our management processes are unfortunately nowhere near as rigorous as our sales processes. As you think about your own individual sales process at your organization, my guess is that they're documented, they're defined, probabilities associated to stages, exit criteria, line marketing collateral, et cetera, et cetera. However, when you look at your management processes, I think you can start to drive a truck through it. Arguably, they're not systematized. They lack really any form of measurement, and they truly don't help us really understand what the best managers are doing in order to replicate those managers. We asked a group that arguably looks like the contours of who's joined this call today. And we asked them how important management processes are towards driving specific KPIs. And more than two-thirds, almost 75% of you guys came back and said that the management process is very important to drive the pipeline, win rates, percentage of sellers at plan, forecast accuracy, and renewal rates. However, take a look at this. And take a look at this right here. More than half of you, the organizations actually report not actually having written down their management process. And those that actually did write it down, it's only a fraction that would suggest that it's highly prescribed in terms of guiding managers towards what to do. And I think it's probably not surprising that we see results that look like this. And give me a second here and let me try and explain what you're looking at. I know it's what you're about to see is fruit salad. What you're looking at is a second line leader's dashboard of an actual customer early in their onboarding, where this manager has 7 direct frontline sales managers reporting in. All the names are, of course, hidden to kind of protect the innocent, so to speak. But I think this is emblematic of what we find in some of our early customers. If you take a look at these managers who arguably have the same span in terms of number of direct reports, calling into the same segments of the market, fundamentally take a different approach in the role. Take a look at a basic metric and the difference in time they spend with the team. One manager here is spending close to 40% of their time with their team, while another 16%. One-on-ones, one manager over 10% of their time, another at 5%. Team meetings. I mean, look at the co-selling component. This is in the market, joint traveling, call partnering, call alongs, ride alongs, whatever term we use today. One manager spending 15, 16% of their time versus one manager that arguably doesn't get to the market nearly at all. And I think this is what we start to see, this kind of mixed bag in terms of performance. And our belief is the inconsistency in the approach that we take in the management role leads to the inconsistency and lack of predictability in our overall sales results. I think when we start to ask the question, if we ran our sales process the way that we ran our management process, what would happen across that particular dimension? And where we're going with all of this is there low-hanging fruit that we can get after on the management process to actually begin to buttress and improve our sales process?
I think
before I do that,
before you go to this, hop back just a moment. I think you said something in there that is so critical that I didn't want it to go to waste. That your point that the lack of consistency in the manager process leads to that lack of predictability in sales outcomes. I don't think, at least to my ear, I don't think that is the common perception amongst B2B sales. I think it is a recognition of the importance of the sales manager, absolutely, but a general importance or an importance of the sales manager solely focused around the role, let's say, of coaching, or solely focused on getting those A players to overachieve. But your point there that the lack of consistency in manager process is the variable that leads to a lack of predictability in sales outcome is a new tie, is a new element. And I know in the next couple of slides, you'll show us where it should be consistent and how it can be consistent. But even as I look at this data here, this tells me, even on this slide, with that lack of variability, it also says that these managers don't yet know what that consistency should look like. So it's not only that it's not even the consistency exists for most managers yet. We really haven't even shown them the way. We might have shown them what good co-selling looks like, or what a good one-on-one looks like, or what good coaching looks like, but we have not told them, and most don't then execute on what the right combination of those things are and how to do so consistency across those 5, 6, 7 people on their team.
Doug, thanks for pausing and kind of summarizing that. I think, yes, in addition to the fact that we haven't been as prescriptive, no doubt about it, but I think the thing that really strikes us, here at Commercial Tribe is the fact that we just don't measure it. We actually can't see it. As senior sales leaders, ops enablement, et cetera, we actually have very, very little visibility in terms of how our managers are spending time, despite how critical we think the role is. And this, you'd asked me to put this slide in the deck, and I don't know, it's your favorite slide, certainly captures, I think, this inability to actually see where our managers are spending time. And when I get to the point, hopefully it's like, aha, we can actually reallocate. But let me kind of frame what you're looking at. As I mentioned, we study the time managers spend on the management process, and we enrich that data with the tenure and performance of their team. What you're seeing right here, and I don't know if my cursor, I'm not as good in this as you are. You're seeing 3 cohorts. First years are the new hires. Second year, this is 12 to 24 months. And then third years is 24 plus months. Within each tenure cohort, you see performance, red, yellow, green. And we define, green is greater than 100%, yellow 70 to 99% of plan, and then red is less than 70%. And this study right here was done earlier this year with about 300 North American B2B sales managers who manage over 1,800 sellers. Okay, so as I said, each bar has 2 colors right here. The first bar, if you look at in the performance colors, one outlines the number of reps, and the other, the percentage of time spent with these reps. So take a look at the far left-hand side. Our first year low performing reps represent 15% of all the reps in this particular study and receive 9% of their manager's time. Let me bookend this on the other side of the equation here with the 3+ years high performers. They make up close to 20% of all reps and received 14% of their manager's attention. Okay, so here's the blemish, if you will. Take a look at these 3+ year high tenured underperformers. High tenured underperformers makes up 10% of all the reps in the study, but take a look at this. They consumed over 25% of their manager's attention. And this is maybe arguably at the expense of spending time with their mid-performers and or less tenured reps. And, look, I'm absolutely not trying to throw rocks, but again, the point being, Doug, we simply just can't see where our managers are spending time. And when we do, there are definitely some ahas about ways in which we can redirect capacity.
Agreed. And the reason why this stuck out to me was, if you are going to install a consistent, repeatable manager process, then that process should prescribe where the biggest bang for the buck is going to be. Now, if the biggest bang for the buck is in getting a tenured low performer to a high performing place, that's all well and good. But I think years of coaching research has come before now to say that that is highly unlikely to actually be the place where you're going to generate that. I think much research has been done around moving that middle, and around the smaller moves at the edges, but just at face value, again, just to that point of without consistency, without prescribed process at the manager level, the average manager is going to make choices that are not in line with what generating high team performance should be.
Yeah, spot on. I'm going to keep pressing and certainly promise to get into the characteristics of high performing managers. And let me hit this one, a bit of a softball, but again, high performance within Commercial Tribe, we actually look at it, it's 100% or greater of plan, both on the management level as well as the individual contributor level. And this first insight, what we found is that 87% of high performing managers have full detailed access to the reps' calendars, while only 32% of lower performing managers have access to their to their reps' calendars. And when you press in and begin to ask and talk to these high performing managers, the things that you start to hear in terms of why is it that you have access? Now, it might be obvious to some, but we were struck in terms of the low performing managers and how few actually had visibility into their calendars. But these high performing managers are going to tell you when they're looking at their reps' calendars, they're looking at, hey, do they actually have dedicated time to prospect? Are they identifying opportunities to co-sell and which calls to join? Forward planning, are they making sure that the reps have got end of month, end of quarter, time dedicated to things as arguably maybe as simple as expense management and things of that nature. The point being here is I think in this new remote world that we found ourselves in, perhaps now more than ever, managing your time, it's the ball game. And as we start to kind of climb in and get at this, when we actually begin to look at the managers' calendars and ask these high performing managers what management events they held most frequently, super crystal clear on this particular dimension. Forecast review, pipeline review, team meetings, call reviews, and call selling. And when you start to press in again and look at these calendar invites and so forth, and look at the way that they actually conduct these management ceremonies, if you will, as you can imagine, structure, outlining, the what, the why, and the how associated with each of these individual events. More often than not, we kind of press in and talk to the lower performing management teams and so forth. We hear things such as, not drawing distinctions between a pipeline review and a forecast review, that it all kind of bubbles into a particular one-on-one, and start to see that kind of fruit salad picture that we see associated to managers not optimizing their time. But beyond the qualitative, I think when you start to study their time spent, you absolutely start to see high performing managers that, again, are just simply more structured in their approach to the role. And this spider diagram, I think, does a nice job of profiling the difference between how a high performing manager spends time and a low performing manager. So if we look at these kind of high performing managers in contrast, 34% more time spent in structured events, that's one-on-ones, forecasts, team meetings, et cetera. 46% less unstructured or open calendar time. And when we climbed into this, what we began to see is that these high performing managers, they're in demand across the organization. They're getting pulled from marketing and finance and ops, et cetera, as the functional groups are trying to do market sensing and things of that nature. And then, of course, what we see here, and it's the big one. This is 200% more time in the market co-selling with their reps. And Doug, I don't know if this is the time to kind of let the cat out of the bag, but
indeed it is. I think it just got out.
It's this metric right here in terms of, if you could take one thing to have an immediate impact in terms of the results in the second half, end of year kind of ascent to the number, it's this one. How do we get our managers into the market and back into the market itself? When we studied this,
I think there were two things that occurred to me with, again, you see, so for those of you, I think there were 11 of you who answered co-selling to the second poll question, being the one thing average managers should be doing more of compared to their peers. So congrats to those 11. There were two things that really occurred to me, Paul, when you and I were going through that data, just sort of in preparation for today. One was there's long been this, I don't want to, it's more than a theory because it has happened, but that companies promote their best sellers. And best sellers get into a management role. And as a result, they need to figure it out because they've never been a manager before. Interestingly, your data would suggest that even if that is true, those best sellers, in terms of their actual activity, are actually being wildly underutilized at the thing that they were really good at. Like that was perhaps the most shocking thing. Was we say constantly, maybe you shouldn't promote your best sellers, but if you do, you need to equip them right. And what your data tells, the story your data tells, is that on the one hand, we're promoting our best sellers and giving them no consistency and no process to actually make them a great manager. Simultaneously, they're actually doing the least amount of the thing that they were great at before. Like, it was a little bit mind-boggling to me in the fact that we are not setting up those great sellers for success in that manager layer, while at the same time sort of not giving them the space to do the thing that actually might have the greatest impact on the organization. And so that point was not lost on me. And I would say to the folks on the call today that you can get the worst of the worst if you don't frame your sales management process properly. You get the worst of you haven't trained your new sales managers in a way that's going to be consistently effective. And if you don't do that, managers will feel like they default away from the very activity that they could give the most value to the organization on.
Doug, there is no doubt about it. Inside the four walls of Commercial Tribe, there is a standing ovation for what you just profiled. I mean, that is it for sure. I think, to your point, the way that we sometimes characterize it is that we've taken our best sellers, promoted them into management roles, and we've turned them into administrators. I mean, think about, and again, I think the call coaching and these conversational intelligence tool absolutely fits within the architecture. But to your point, when you're making a sales call and your manager, or arguably even your manager's manager, decides to join that call, it's a different sales call, right? This is, hey, we want to go through pre-call prep. What's my role? What's the objective of the call? How do we begin to debrief that call? It's a fundamentally different sales call than I think, okay, oh boy, here we are. It's Tuesday. I'm a little late for my call. Boom, I'm on it. I've done very, very little prep. Look, again, I'm not trying to throw rocks. I was a sales executive. I understand how that goes.
Yeah,
but nonetheless, please.
I was just gonna say, I think it's a great time to pick up Janet's question from chat, which is how would you define co-selling in this context? I think you and I both would agree, Paul, with Janet's comment that it is not the manager taking over the conversation or being the leader of the conversation always. So wondering your take on how you would define co-selling in this context.
That's exactly right. It's the AKA the ride along or the call along. It's a manager participating in a market-facing type of activity or an event. And look, we're all subject of it and so forth. And I think if you talk to my team, not that I don't like to talk a lot and so forth, but I have a way of kind of bumping in and not taking over calls, but trying to pick my spot. And I think that's a concern that many, I think senior sales leaders have about, managers jumping in on calls. But to the point that they're not really spending any of their time in the market, I think getting into calls is certainly a net positive. But again, definition is them kind of joining calls.
Cool.
Doug, anything else on this before I kind of press in and kind of start to wrap this up a little bit?
Let's keep at it.
Okay. Super busy slide. And I think while you can kind of get the guy out of the Gartners and the CEBs, hard to get the Gartner and the CEBs out of the guy. And they probably would chastise me for this very, very busy, intensive slide. But we get the question all the time. Okay, Paul, so got it. We need to start managing and measuring and putting frameworks together beyond just the kind of PowerPoints and spreadsheets that we build for our operating cadence. How much time should we be allocating across these individual events themselves? And here is, after collecting data on thousands of sales managers, best practices that we see associated to the events themselves, the frequency, and the best practice ranges themselves. Certainly make this available to the group post and so forth. But as you start to think about, climbing into tomorrow, balance of the second half, Q3, Q4, wherever you are in your fiscal year, if you were to look at kind of your average team, so 6 individual direct reports, the way that we look at these time ranges and so forth is we use a 40-hour per work week and a 13-week rolling calendar quarter is how we actually get at these percentages of time. What we would suggest that teams focus in on are the kind of core 5 events themselves. So pipeline forecast, team meetings, co-selling, as well as the call reviews themselves. By the way, one quick mention that I'll profile, I actually didn't highlight itself down here, is this concept of a block. We see them on all managers' times, but I do believe in addition to aligning enablement teams to these events to reinforce how to actually conduct these exercises, the block is one of those that I think is misunderstood amongst sales teams. And what I'm referring to is it time for the sales manager to think to your kind of order out of chaos and so forth. When do they actually have dedicated time to reflect on, retrospect, prior week, plan forward, begin to prepare for upcoming events? We see the best managers actually leverage this time. It's not time to get lunch or do email or things of that nature, but time to actually forward plan. And again, just cannot emphasize enough, the need to get our managers back into the market. And I think you start to move your managers back into the market, you'll see an immediate lift in pipeline volume, velocity. And by the way, what we're talking about is 10% to 15%. So think about this for a minute. 10% on a 40-hour work week is 4 hours, 15%, 6 hours. So getting your managers to do 4 sales calls a week, if in fact that's an hour per, is that an unreasonable ask? And to think that they're actually not, we come into most organizations, it's in the less than 3% of time is actually spent in the market. There is an immediate opportunity that I think we can all begin to leverage. Okay, Doug, so steps in kind of building a world-class management process itself. Number one, how do we get access to all calendars? We need visibility into what our managers and our reps are doing, kind of first and foremost. Number two, we would focus in on kind of the events that matter most, pipeline forecast, the team meeting. I do put the block in there right there, and co-selling. Define the events, the what, the why, the how. Again, more often than not, what we see is, light prescription, if no prescription at all, in terms of the pipeline, the forecast, the deal review, how to co-sell. I think that is a great enablement exercise that we can run, Friday brown bag, however you want to characterize it, to help managers understand, how do I co-sell? What are the things they should be doing in a pre-call prep? How do I define my role? How do we begin to do the post-call debrief, et cetera, et cetera. Get managers in the market, right? The bottom of our card says sales, let's get into the market as much as we can, pick our spots. If in fact you can bias the mid performers and those new hires, I think, Doug, to your point, how much juice are we really going to get out of the, hey, let me travel with the high tenured high performer squeeze? Probably not as much, in fact, not as much as the mid tenure, less lower performing types of reps themselves. And then finally, to the point around building enablement curriculums around these operating events, super important. Doug, let me pause there, see if you have any comments before we get to a little bit of an offer that we have for the group, and take any comments, questions that the team might have.
No, all good. I've got a few connection points. I think the one thing we haven't touched on yet that I'll share here in just a few moments is how you co-sell, the message you deliver in the customer conversation, and how you are coaching your team in those one-on-one moments, in those team calls, et cetera, actually then matters a lot to then those activities being as successful and valuable as possible to, as you said earlier, the predictable revenue and the predictable selling. Because if you are co-selling and coaching and talking with your team about things that don't matter or not highly relevant to the conversation that the buyer is expecting in that next customer call in the market, you're actually still leaving dollars on the table when it comes to the predictability of the sale and the predictability of the revenue off the back end of all this great manager process and activity.
Doug, I think that's spot on. And, I think organizations like the DSGs of the world are focused in and around this space. And I think if I followed it right, I'm signed up for a webinar next Tuesday. So
on Tuesday, you are indeed,
right? Yeah. Good. Okay, hey, last slide. Certainly not a product pitch per se, but certainly if we can be helpful, please come to our website, so commercialtribe.com, and you'll find in this resources a build your revenue operating cadence. And it's just a set of tools. So it's defining what the events are. It's giving some prescriptive detail about, how much recommended time, but it's also outlining the what, the why, the how, et cetera, et cetera. And I am a sales manager at heart, and there's just absolutely nothing we wouldn't do to try and advocate for the collective cause of getting more individual contributors to the higher sides of their comp plan and OTEs, and getting more and more managers into sales management and elevating inside the organization. So with that, Doug, I don't know if we want to turn it over to questions. Hopefully I'm on time here, and
no, you are all good. Let me add that last layer, and certainly as questions come in across chat and Q&A, folks can continue to do that. Let me jump to my screen here. I should be able to take this from you. Just to give folks a framework to think about. There you go. Do you see a slide that says focus coaching at the top there, Paul?
Yes.
Excellent. So just to give the group a chance to think about, again, that big takeaway from the Commercial Tribe data to me was how much sales managers can get out of more time with their team structured in the right ways. Co-selling, one-on-one meetings, those forecast reviews. But in order for managers to do that well, and again, this I think sometimes is where we collectively might fail those new managers, is the focus on coaching specifically, always a big deal. But do those managers actually know in those moments the content that their sellers need to be equipped with? How can they actually help drive the right content into that next customer conversation, the right content that needs to be coached on, the right skill that the seller needs to execute in that next meeting, in that next call? That one-on-one is not going to be nearly as effective if the manager and the seller aren't on the same page as to the right content. They need to master coaching. They need to be better in all of those time with team moments, because a few folks have dropped this into the chat, and I fully agree. Manager can't be everywhere. And so even if co-selling, as you saw from Paul's data, let's say best practice 10 to 15% of time, again, in that 40-hour work week, 4 to 6 hours, that's still only perhaps on average 1 call per rep per week. That's not huge. There are still many more calls that your sellers are executing, even if you can review them in the background. So your ability to master coaching such that your reps can go execute solo is still a absolutely critical part of that manager cadence. And it has to occur within those one-on-ones, those team meetings, et cetera. But then last is leveraging the context of the other components. So in that time with team, even in that solo time, are you leveraging those revenue intelligence tools as best as you can? Are you picking out the right call recordings to listen to and then provide coaching on? Are you, as a sales manager and leader, picking out the right deals in the forecast where your time is going to be valuable? So even with more co-selling and getting to that point and systemizing that with your team, there is still a vast array of seller activity that's going to occur without you. And how do you ensure that you are equipping your teams to be better in those moments as well? Not only that, and for those of you who have been fans of Corporate Vision's webinars, you'll know that we know that acquisition conversations and expansion conversations are not the same. So as you're prepping for a co-selling meeting with your teams, are you asking them, is it acquisition? Is it expansion? And as a result, do you know what conversation your team needs to execute in that moment? Are you defeating that net new prospect status quo? Are you trying to get them to change and change with you? Or is that conversation around defending the status quo of an existing customer and asking them to stay or evolve with you along the way? Because if you in your co-selling, in your coaching, in your team time are not thinking about the different psychology that your buyers have and the different stories that your sellers need to deliver, well, then there's no way you're going to reinforce the right skills. And so it is to us this combination of Paul's data shows the path to the right time spend and the right operating cadence. And as you can tell to the title of the webinar, When you leave your managers at their own disposal, they're going to be trusting their gut first and foremost. But then when you make that change to then adding in the time spend with then the right customer conversation, that is where you're going to get your maximum return on your sales manager dollar. Are you spending the right activities matched up with the right customer conversations at the right time, so that the actual customer conversation, where the rubber hits the road on all things sales, is actually as valuable as possible, getting the buyer to the right place in that context along the way. Paul, any thoughts on that combination from your side there, and what you're seeing on your side too?
Yeah, spot on. I think that's absolutely right. I think these manager activities, one is, how do we define them and begin to become more prescriptive in terms of getting our managers to be running the operating cadence and increasing the overall RPM. So I think there's goodness within that framework in and of itself. And I don't know if I'd characterize this as a 201 level, Doug, in terms of what you're outlining here, but maybe it is. As we begin to try and shift our L&D dollars, again, the opening question is, how important is the frontline sales manager to this overall equation? And everybody comes back and says, yeah, critical, linchpin, force multiplier, et cetera, et cetera. But are we actually making investments in that and basically profiling what you've got outlined right here? And I think when we get this right, we can see a demonstrable, a step function lift in overall productivity once we start to harness our frontline sales managers and directing them differently than we are arguably today.
Yeah, and it's that 180-degree difference, and I know I changed slides here, that 180-degree difference between how that acquisition sales conversation has to happen, where you are focused on getting the buyer to change and choose you, 180 degrees different than that customer expansion conversation where you're getting the buyer to stay or evolve. But even in the middle, these two supporting value conversations, how are you working with your client executives to have a great executive conversation at the C level around why they should invest and do so now? And even then with procurement, how are you going to negotiate and get them to pay what you want them to pay and sign when you want them to sign? And so every activity that you see in Paul's data has to feed, at the end of the day, a customer conversation. That's where the rubber hits the road. And it is important for that activity that the manager to be doing to support the right customer conversation. And back to that slide, Paul, that you had with revenue intelligence on one line, sales manager intelligence on the other, the right sales management process will align with the right sales process and be mutually reinforcing, and all in service of, as we call it here at Corporate Visions, the customer deciding journey. How are both in service of getting your buyer to make a decision in your favor and make a decision that is right for them in your favor along the way?
Spot on.
So we've been talking across the course of the webinar here around sort of bringing order to chaos a little bit, bringing order to consistency to how managers spend their time. And I happen to, across the last couple of years, I've been in pursuit, very slowly, by the way, of my private pilot's license. And when you're in pursuit of your private pilot's license, you realize how much chaos is actually happening in the skies above you as you fly. What you're seeing on your screen now is actually the radar from about 9:50 a.m. this morning at Deer Valley Airport in Phoenix, Arizona. Deer Valley Airport in Phoenix, Arizona. It's one of the busiest private airfields in the country. And you'll notice, actually, even in this picture, this is about a 2-mile radius. You'll see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different aircraft, all being managed by that tower. And now, for those of you who've never looked at radar before, this may look very chaotic. But when you're a private pilot and when you are flying in exceptionally busy airspace, there is always a process and a cadence of activities that must be followed so that everyone lands on the ground safely. And it looks an awful lot like this. And this is what happens at Deer Valley and every other airport like it. When you are trying to land, you follow this 6-step process every time. And I promise you that if you don't, there will be another pilot that calls you out on it. You're going to enter that traffic pattern. You're going to make a left turn onto what they call the base leg, another left turn onto the final leg. And maybe you need to go around. Some of us have been in planes where you need to go around, and then you're going to go to 4, you're going to go to 5 or 6. Whether you're coming in on the left-hand side of the airport or the right-hand side of the airport, you have a prescribed process at that airfield every time. The next time you're up in an airplane for your commercial travel, I promise you it's the same thing. But without the process, without the cadence, I promise you that radar would look nothing like this. And it actually would mean that lives are at risk along the way. Now, lives are not at risk in the sales management process, but the lack of process, the lack of consistency, the lack of any order in that chaos is harming your business, especially when those new managers aren't spending the time where they need to. And so, Paul, thanks for joining us here today.
Yeah, sure.
In addition to the link that I know we dropped into chat for yours, would love for folks to get the link here on the screen or use your phones for the QR code there in the middle. Would love for folks to download the 4 Value Conversations ebook here from our side, and really where the rubber hits the road on that manager and customer conversations. Paul, any last thoughts from your side here?
No, I mean, your comment, I was just trying to jump in there at the very end when we say, hey, look, it's not life and death, but, flying airplanes is. I don't mean to sound overly dramatic here, but I make the argument that, look, this is where we're spending time. This is how we're trying to feed families of 4 and so forth, and, advance ourselves professionally, and, taking a haphazard approach, and not suggesting that we take a haphazard approach, but the ability to put more rigor into this. And what I think you'll begin to find is you start to put more attention on the management process. You will start to see meaningful lifts, 5, 8, 10%. I think we know a lot about the way sellers sell. I think we know very, very little about the way our managers manage, and the more prescription that we can put into that. This is the role of the CRO. This is their job, is to help architect this operating cadence and hold their managers accountable to executing across it.
Awesome. We've got a few minutes for questions, and I do see a few here in chat. Paul, what do you feel, or what have you seen is the right ratio of managers to number of reps?
Yeah, we see it. And by the way, we collect not only managers, but the tenure and so forth. And very often do we actually see the design of a management span take into consideration either A, the tenure of the sales manager, or B, the tenure of the team. In other words, a team of 6 to 8 high tenured high performers is a much different exercise than a team of 6 to 8 less tenured new hires. But what we see in the database is roughly it's around 6. And it's made up of mostly kind of B2B knowledge intensive types of industries, but it's about 6.
Gotcha. You and I were chatting about this very question via email. So I think Ivan's question here is a good one. Sometimes it's delicate to ask a senior rep to give you detailed access to their calendar. Is there a trick or a theme to make them feel good about it?
Yeah. So one, I think it does speak to the culture of an organization. Coming out of the Gartners and the CEDs of the world, I mean, there was just transparency. You could join any call that you wanted to. So I do think it's at the senior sales leadership level that, everything is transparent. And what we're trying to do, and to answer the question specifically, is we're trying to understand what the best do and how they spend their time, and really begin to study and learn and share those individual best practices. By the way, when we capture calendar events, we're not looking for, hey, I dropped the kids off, going to get a haircut, dentist appointment. All of those through an AI engine get kind of filtered out, but it's the structured events that we're after. But I think as people start to understand, hey, what we're looking for is to try and identify and spot best practices and share them. I think the best want to learn from the best.
I agree. Cool. Well, that rounds it out. Again, to all the participants here on the call, thanks so much for joining today. Hope you found it valuable as we sought to bring a little bit of order to the chaos of sales management. But Paul, thanks again for joining us, and I'm sure we'll have you back at another point in time.
Doug, you're awesome. CDI, thank you.
No problem, everybody. Have a great afternoon.